The Spell, Part 1, Chapter 3. If one could have looked within Uncle Peabody's room after the other guests had snuffed out their candles, he would have discovered its inmate seated beside the flickering light, with an open letter in his hand. He had read it over many times since its receipt nearly 3 months earlier, announcing in Helen's characteristic way her engagement and approaching marriage. No one else had ever come so closely into his life, and he felt a certain responsibility to satisfy himself that the girl had made no mistake in the important step which she had taken. Now that he had actually met her husband, he again perused the lines which had introduced his new nephew to him. "It has actually happened at last," the letter began, "and your favorite wager of 1,000 to 1 on the unexpected has really won. In other words, I, Helen Cartwright, condemned by myself to live and die an old maid as penalty for being so critical of the genus Homo, now confess myself completely, hopelessly in love, and so happy in my new estate that I wonder why I ever hesitated. It is all so curious. The things which interested me before now seem so commonplace compared to the events to come in connection with this broader existence which is opening up before me. How infinitely more gratifying it is to feel myself living for and a part of another's life. How comforting to know that some other personality whom I can love and respect feels himself to be living for and a part of my life. It adds to the seriousness of it all, but how it increases the satisfaction. I wish I could describe John Armstrong to you, but now that I am about to make the attempt I realize how difficult a task I have undertaken. He is 8 years older than I, but sometimes he seems to be years younger, while again I feel almost like a child beside him. No, Uncle Peabody, it is not a similar case to that little Mrs. Johnson, whom you quoted when you were last home, as saying that a woman feels as old as the way her husband treats her. I know this will pop into your mind, so I will promptly head you off. The fact is that Jack is a very remarkable man. He is handsome, with a great strength of character showing in every feature. He is tall and athletic, but it is his wonderful mental ability which will most impress you. Think of a man playing on the Harvard Varsity 11, rowing on the crew, and yet graduating with a summa cum laude. Jack is a superb dancer, thus disproving the common belief that a man can't be clever at both ends, and at the assemblies, even before we were engaged, I used to anticipate those numbers which he had taken more than all the others. Besides this, his conversation was always so original, touching frequently upon topics which were new to me. His particular fad is what he calls humanism, and his particular loves the great writers of the past, his divinities, as he calls them. You probably understand just what all this means, but alas, most of it is beyond my comprehension. What he tells me interests me, of course. It even fascinates me. I can follow him up to a certain point. Then we reach my limitations, and I am forced to admit my lack of understanding. That is when I feel so like an infant beside him. He is as patient as can be, and insists that When once I am in Florence, where the air itself is heavy with the learning of the past, I shall be able to comprehend it all, and it will mean the same to me as it does to him. I wish I felt as confident. We are to be married in April, and Jack has taken the Villa Cotilombra in Settignano for the season. We expect to arrive there early in May, and we want you to come to us for just as long a visit as you can arrange. You won't disappoint me, will you, dear Uncle Peabody? We all have been broken-hearted that you have so long delayed your return, and one of the events in our plans for Florence, to which I am looking forward with the greatest eagerness, is this visit with you. Write and tell me how your work progresses, but don't say I told you so. This would show that you really expected it all the time, and your favorite argument would lose its force. Just say that you will come to us at Settignano. The letter itself showed that Helen had changed much during the months since he had last seen her. There was a more serious undertone and a broader outlook, due undoubtedly to Armstrong's influence. Uncle Peabody wondered whether Helen could have been attracted to this man by her admiration for his mental strength rather than by any real sentiment, perhaps mistaking the one for the other. This was the point he wished to settle in his own mind, and this was why he had studied them both from the moment of his arrival, much more carefully than either of them realized. Armstrong was a remarkable man, as Helen had said, even in the few hours he had known him. Uncle Peabody found much to admire. It was true that his manner towards Helen showed indulgence, almost as to a child rather than to a wife, but his devotion was entirely obvious, and this relation was to be expected after reading Helen's letter. Still, Mr. Cartwright told himself, the existence of this relation necessitates a certain readjustment before a perfection of united interests could be attained. Armstrong was bound to be the dominating force, and Helen must inevitably respond to this new influence. Strange as it now seemed to her, his knowledge of her sympathetic and intuitive grasp of his own pet theories gave him confidence to believe that this response would be equally prompt and comprehensive. Henry Peabody Cartwright was distinctly a citizen of the world. Boston had been his birthplace. Boston had been the base of his eminently successful business operations, and his name still figured in the list of the city's largest taxpayers. Beyond this, the city of his early activity had, during the past 20 years, seen him only as a visitor at periodic intervals. He had emerged from his commercial environment at the age of 40 with a firm determination to gratify his ideals. Fortunately for him, and for mankind as well, his ideals were not fully crystallized when he set out to gratify them. Boston was entirely satisfactory to him as an abiding place, but he felt a leaven at work within him which demanded a larger arena than even the outlying territory of Greater Boston covered. He started, therefore, in the late 80s for a trip around the world with the definite purpose, as he himself announced, of giving things a chance to happen to him. I have no schedule and no plans, he said to those who questioned him. I shall hitch my wagon to a star, but always with my grip near at hand, so that I may change stars upon a moment's notice. There were no immediate family ties to interfere, but the carrying out of what seemed to his friends to be rather quixotic ideas. There may have been some youthful romance, but if so, no one ever succeeded in learning anything of it from him. It is all perfectly simple, he once good-naturedly replied to a persistent relative. The girls I was willing to marry would not have me, and those who would have me I was not willing to marry. I used to think that I would become more attractive as I grew older, but I have given up that idea now. Once I tried to rub a freckle off with sandpaper and pumice stone and found blood under the skin, but the freckle, the same old freckle, is there to this day. His devotion to women in the composite was consistent and sincere. The fondness which existed between himself and his brother's family was such that his departure had left a distinct void, and his visits home were events circled with red ink in the family calendar. He enjoyed these visits no less than they, but with never more than a day or two of warning. He would announce his intentions of leaving for Egypt or India or some spot more or less remote in his quest for the unexpected. To his reproaches which were levelled at him, he replied, with a smile which defied controversy, I am just as sorry not to be with you all as you can possibly be to have me away, but I have educated myself to the separation, and have thus overcome the necessity for personal propinquity. On that first trip around the world, Uncle Peabody found one of his ideals, although he did not realize its vast importance until several years later. Japan appealed to him, and the longer he remained there, the more impressed he became with certain of the national characteristics. First of all, he marveled at the evenness of temper which the people displayed, at their endurance, their patience. He watched the carefulness with which they weighed the importance of each problem before accepting its responsibility, and their utter abandon in carrying through when once undertaken. This was 20 years before the Russo-Japanese War, and he had come among them with the existing Occidental estimate of their paganism and barbarity. It may have been a species of incredulity leading to curiosity which induced him to remain among them, but as a result of his sojourn, he discovered that they were philosophers rather than fatalists, geniuses rather than barbarians. He questioned his new hosts when he came to know them better, and was told quite seriously and quite naturally that they never became angry, because anger produced poison in the system and retarded digestion, that upon digestion depended health, that upon health depended happiness, and upon happiness depended personal efficiency and life itself. They explained that forethought was one of the cardinal factors of their creed, but added that its antithesis, fear thought, was equally important as an element to be eliminated. They called his attention to the fact that they did not live upon what they ate, but upon what they digested, and that by masticating their food more thoroughly than he did, they secured from the quantity, the same amount of nourishment, without needlessly overloading their systems with undigested food which could not possibly be assimilated. This last theory did not altogether appeal to Peabody Cartwright at first. His friends at the Somerset Club still held memories of his Epicurean proclivities, and they were not wary even yet of recalling the time when he had won a goodly wager by naming, blindfolded, 5 different vintages of Burgundy and Bordeaux. But the more he thought it over, the more convinced he became that the something to which he had promised to give a chance had really happened to him. He pondered, he experimented, but he still continued to eat larger quantities of food than the Japanese. A year later he was in Italy, and in Venice, Mr. Cartwright suddenly discovered that he had found the geographical center of the civilized world. With Venice as the starting point, one could reach London or Constantinople, St. Petersburg or New York with equal exertion. Venice, therefore, became his adopted home, although it could claim no more of his presence than any of the dozen other cities in the 4 quarters of the globe. During the 20 years, he had succeeded in making himself a part of each one, had become a veritable citizen of the world, but by no means a man without a country. Italy served to drive home the truth which Japan had first shown him. 3 years after his experience there, a dingy second-hand bookstore in Florence had placed him in possession of Luigi Cornaro's Discorsi della Vita Sobria. He read it with amazement, here in his hand, written by a Venetian nobleman more than 300 years before, at the age of 83, was the textbook of the theories of life which he had accepted from the Japanese as new and untried, except among the alien people. It gave him a start, and he journeyed to Turin, Bern, Berlin, Brussels, Paris, London, St. Petersburg, and even back to Boston, seeking to interest the famous physiologists in his discovery, which he believed was destined to exterminate disease and to transform those practicing the medical profession into hygienic engineers. Mr. Cartwright's name and personality preserved him from a sanitarium, but his theories as to self-control, forethought, and fear-thought received ample opportunity for personal experiment. He was as tenacious as if his future depended upon the outcome. A good-natured indulgence here and an incredulous sympathy there gave him his first opportunities for demonstration. He not only drew upon his fortune, but freely contributed himself as a subject for experiment. It had been slow, but he had learned patience from the Japanese. Disbelief gradually changed into doubt, doubt into question, question into half-belief, and half-belief into conviction. Quietly, surely, his own faith was assimilated by those high in the physiological ranks, and almost against their will, and before they realized the importance of their concessions, he had forced them to prove him right by their own analysis. The last 5 years had been a studied triumph. He had found his ideals, but he had not attained them. He knew what his life work was, and had the gratification of counting among his friends and collaborators the highest authorities the world recognized. The habits of generations could not be changed in a moment. Some of them could never be changed, but the ball had been started and was gaining in size with each revolution. It no longer needed his gentle, persuasive push. It had its own momentum now, and he found it only necessary to guide its advance and to watch its growth. Uncle Peabody's thoughts reverted to his work as he folded Helen's letter and placed it again in his pocket, where he had so long carried it. He regretted having his labors interrupted just now, but he found himself keenly interested to watch Helen's approaching evolution. His wagon was firmly hitched to this new star, and he had no notion of changing stars. So, with a murmured "Bless you, my children, may you live forever, and may I come to your funeral," he sought the repose which the others had already found.